Bar Harbor, Maine, late autumn. The morning was damp and foggy. Rain pounded on the roof of the car as if someone were throwing handfuls of small pebbles. Daniel Brooks held the steering wheel tightly, even though his speed had already dropped to almost zero. The windshield was fogged up, the wipers squeaked, but that didn't help with the murky veil ahead. He was driving from Bangor to Portland on business, and this stretch of road always seemed endless to him, deserted, with rare houses, where the wind carried maple leaves along the roadside. In the passenger seat sat Emily, his 9-year-old daughter, wrapped in a gray coat. Her head was slightly tilted toward her shoulder, her eyes fixed somewhere deep in the rainy landscape, and not a single movement of her face betrayed any interest in what was happening. It was almost always like this: silence and detachment. The car jerked as if it had lost its balance for a moment and came to a halt at the side of the road. Daniel cursed under his breath and got out, feeling the cold dampness seeping under his collar. The hood opened with a creak, but he immediately realized that they would not make it to Portland today. Something was wrong with the engine, and there was no point in trying to fix it on the spot. His phone showed almost no signal. The only options were to wait for help or find shelter. Then he noticed a small building across the road with a faded sign that read, Seaside Diner. The windows were fogged up and silhouettes of people flashed inside. The decision came naturally. He helped Emily out of the car, pulling the hood over her head, and they ran across the road, jumping over puddles as the wind drove the rain into their faces. The cafe door opened with a soft jingle, and they were enveloped in warmth. The smell of fresh bread, cinnamon, and fried oil immediately enveloped them like a warm blanket. The floors creaked, someone hummed quietly to themselves in the far corner, and the coffee machine murmured at the counter. Daniel helped Emily take off her coat and led her to a free table by the window. It was warm and cozy here, with lamps under lampshades giving off a soft golden light. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 30s, wearing a faded sweater and an apron stained with flour. Her hair was pulled back into a casual bun, and there was something in her eyes that immediately made it easier to breathe. She noticed them and approached, wiping her hands on a towel. "Good morning. Would you like something to warm up?" Her voice was soft, with a slight hoarseness, as if she had talked or sung a lot the day before. Daniel nodded. "Tea, black, and something warm for my daughter." The woman, her name tag said Claire, looked at Emily not as a customer, but as if trying to understand what she needed more right now, food or just attention. She smiled slightly, nodded, and walked away to the counter. Daniel leaned back in his chair, trying to stretch his fingers, which had gone numb during the trip. Emily sat motionless, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the floor. A couple of minutes later, Claire returned with 2 steaming mugs and a small plate with a bun sprinkled with powdered sugar. She placed them on the table, but instead of leaving, she suddenly stood on tiptoe and reached for the top shelf of the counter. There stood an old porcelain doll in a blue dress, clearly long since outgrown by children's hands. Claire carefully removed it and approached Emily. "I think she'd like to sit with you for a while," she said quietly and placed the doll on the edge of the table. Daniel raised his eyebrows but said nothing. Emily usually didn't react to such gestures, but this time she slowly raised her eyes, looked at the doll and reached for it. Her fingers touched the cold porcelain and lingered on the lace collar. Daniel froze. Even more surprising was that his daughter's lips moved slightly. The sound was almost inaudible, as quiet as a breath, but it was there. It wasn't a word, more of a fragment, a whisper, and Daniel couldn't make out what she had said. But Claire, standing nearby, had clearly heard it. Her eyes warmed even more for a moment, and she nodded to Emily as if agreeing with something very important. Daniel felt a strange, long-forgotten feeling rising inside him. It was like cautious hope, too fragile to touch with words. He just took a sip of hot tea to hide how his hands were shaking and thought that the morning, which had started with cold rain and a breakdown, had suddenly changed its flavor. The next day the clouds hung lower than usual, and the sea beyond Bar Harbor looked leaden and motionless. Daniel drove his car down a narrow street lined with wooden houses with peeling paint, feeling that he could only half explain this return to himself. The official version was simple. He had supposedly left his wool scarf in the cafe, the one he always kept in his car in case of cold winds. The real reason was different. He remembered too clearly the moment yesterday when Emily had reached for something herself for the first time in a long time, and how Claire had stood nearby as if she knew what to do. The cafe was almost empty. Only a man in a worn sweater sat by the window, his face weathered by wind and time. On the table in front of him was a mug of coffee and a small notebook in which he was making notes with a blunt pencil. Daniel entered, the bell rang again, and from somewhere deep inside came the sound of running water. Claire behind the counter noticed him and nodded, but this time she didn't come over right away. He was in no hurry to take a seat. His gaze involuntarily lingered on the old man by the window. The man looked up and nodded as they do in small towns, where a stranger becomes part of the familiar landscape if he comes twice. Without thinking, Daniel approached and asked permission to sit down. The old man shrugged. He smelled of sea salt and tobacco. When the waitress, a young girl with freckles, not Claire, placed Daniel's coffee in front of him, the old man struck up a conversation. He asked what had brought him there. Daniel replied evasively that he had ended up in Bar Harbor on his way somewhere else, stopped at the cafe and paused to think. The old man grunted and said that many people stayed here, some because of the sea, others because of the people. Then his eyes narrowed and as if testing Daniel's reaction he added, "I saw you with Claire yesterday. She rarely acts like that with anyone." He didn't finish his sentence but his tone made it clear what he meant. Daniel cautiously asked what he meant. The old man took a sip, looked out the window where raindrops were slowly rolling down the glass, and said that Claire rarely got close even to regular customers. "She's a good girl but she has her own pain," he added as if putting an end to the conversation. When asked for clarification the old man shrugged as if to say it was none of his business, but the word tragedy slipped into his voice. Daniel felt his curiosity growing, mixed with caution. In small towns rumors often have a life longer than the truth, and do not always coincide with it. But the way the old man said that word left no doubt, there was something behind it. He left the fisherman with his coffee and walked over to the counter. Claire, busy arranging fresh loaves of bread on the shelf, noticed him out of the corner of her eye. He said he had come for a scarf he might have forgotten yesterday. She nodded, went into the back room and returned with a gray bundle. Her face wore a neutral smile, her eyes were wary. Daniel thanked her but did not leave. He asked how long she had been working there. Claire replied briefly, "A couple of years." He clarified that he had heard good things about her. She tensed slightly and asked who exactly had said that. When he mentioned the old man by the window, her gaze shifted to the side, and her hands began to move with the tension that comes when a person is looking for an excuse to end a conversation. Daniel gently asked what tragedy she was referring to. Claire put the towel on the counter, paused for a moment as if weighing her words and then said in an even voice, "People like to make up stories. Especially when it's not their life." Then she turned and walked into the kitchen, leaving behind the smell of fresh bread and the feeling that the conversation was over. Daniel remained standing at the counter, scarf in hand, feeling that he had received fewer answers than questions. But along with that came a strange feeling, as if he were on the verge of something important, and all he had to do was take one more step to find out the truth. However, that step would have to be taken carefully because Claire clearly had doors that she locked from the inside, and other people's keys didn't fit. On the third day, Daniel no longer tried to deceive himself about the reasons for his visit. He had repaired the car and he could have continued his business in Portland, but he was once again driving to the same little cafe on the outskirts of Bar Harbor. The sea outside the car windows was rough, white crests rolling onto the shore, and the wind carried the smell of salt and seaweed down the street. He wanted to believe that this was just a convenient stop along the way, but inside him grew another feeling, a desire to see Claire talk to Emily again in a way that none of the specialists had been able to. The cafe was crowded. Tourists in raincoats and fishermen in knitted hats were chatting noisily at the tables. Claire was standing behind the counter, arranging pies in the display case, and looked the same as in the past, except that the shadows under her eyes had deepened. Daniel waited until she was free and, catching her eye, suggested they talk aside. She was a little surprised but nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. He said bluntly that he needed help. He explained that Emily was difficult to communicate with, that he had tried dozens of ways, but all to no avail. He told her that last night, for the first time in a long time, she had tried to say a word, and it had happened with Claire. He asked her to work with his daughter for a few days while he was in town, not as a waitress, but as a mentor and companion for the girl. Claire listened, but her face gradually became closed. She shook her head and, before he could continue, said that it was impossible. Her tone was calm but final. She cited her mortgage payments, which forced her to work shifts, and the need to care for her mother, who lived outside the city and required constant attention. It all sounded plausible, even too plausible, and Daniel, accustomed to listening to people in negotiations, detected the intonation of a rehearsed answer in her voice. He didn't argue on the spot. Claire went back to her business and he sat down at a table by the window, watching her move between the kitchen and the hall, as if each step was calculated so as not to linger anywhere too long. Inside he had a growing feeling that it wasn't about debts or his mother. There was something else, carefully hidden, and he didn't know why, but that something else now mattered to him. Later, back at the hotel, he called an old acquaintance from Portland who was better at finding information about people than any search engine. A few hours later, he was holding a printout in his hands. Name, Claire Morgan. Education, University of Vermont, Department of Special Education, excellent grades, scholarships, teacher recommendations. Before moving to Bar Harbor, she was listed as an assistant at a private school for children with disabilities. And then, a sharp break. No mention of work in this field, no publications, not a single professional reference. Just a change of address and a note about employment at a cafe. Daniel pored over the lines, trying to understand what could have made a person with such a profile give up everything. If it had been just burnout or financial problems, she would surely have returned to the field where she excelled. But she had chosen a completely different path and clearly avoided talking about the past. His thoughts wouldn't leave him alone. He remembered how Claire held the doll in her hands, how she leaned quietly toward Emily, without rushing or making any unnecessary movements, as if she knew exactly how not to spoil this fragile moment. Such things are not taught in waiter training courses, and not even all professionals possess them. It was a skill acquired through years of work and, perhaps, personal experience. Daniel understood that until he could learn the truth, all his attempts to bring Claire closer to Emily would be doomed. But he also felt that direct pressure would only push her away even more. So he would have to wait for the moment when she herself allowed him to look into her past, even if that past was painful. In the evening he went out to the embankment. The wind tore at his hood, and the waves crashed against the rocks with a heavy rumble. He looked at the dark line of the horizon and thought about how, in negotiations, he always knew the price of every deal. Here the stakes were different. And it wasn't just about the daughter he wanted to help. It was about a woman who seemed to have forgotten that she had the power to change someone's life. Daniel didn't expect Claire to agree. After her cold refusal, he was almost certain that any attempt to return to this conversation would only push her further away. But the town was small and their paths crossed naturally. He would meet her in the morning at the grocery store where she was carrying a basket of flour and apples, or he would see her walking her neighbor's old Labrador, or he would notice her in line at the post office. Each time they exchanged a brief greeting, sometimes a few words about the weather or the catch at the harbor, but in these fragments, he could sense that the icy crust between them was beginning to melt. The decisive moment came on one of those gray but quiet evenings. The cafe was almost empty, and Daniel had only come in for a coffee. Emily was with him, quietly leafing through a picture book as she sat by the window. Claire approached, placed a mug on the table, and without looking directly at him, said that she could try working with Emily a couple of hours a week, just to give him a break. She clarified that it was temporary and meant nothing. He just nodded, realizing that any attempt to express his joy in words might scare her away. The first few days were difficult. Emily hardly reacted to Claire, turning away when she tried to offer a game and pursing her lips when spoken to. Claire didn't insist. She brought simple wooden toys, laid them out on the table, and began to play by herself as if Emily didn't exist at all. Daniel watched and didn't understand the point of it until, on the third day, he noticed that the girl was already watching her movements, albeit surreptitiously. Gradually, Claire began to find small cracks in Emily's closed world. First, it was a drawing. The girl reached for a pencil when Claire accidentally dropped it on the floor. Then there was a walk to the pier. Claire walked alongside her without taking her hand, and told stories in a quiet voice about the old boats moored at the piers. Emily listened without asking questions, but her steps fell in time with the words. Daniel stayed nearby more and more often. He told himself it was necessary to see progress, but in reality he just wanted to be part of these small victories. Sometimes he noticed Claire glancing at him quickly when Emily did something new, and there was more to those glances than just a work report. The attraction between them grew not because of romantic gestures, but in the silence, in the small moments. When he handed her a thermos of hot tea on the windy pier and she quietly thanked him. When she adjusted the blanket on Emily's lap, and he suddenly noticed that her fingers were trembling, even though it wasn't that cold outside. He sensed that she was afraid of something, but he didn't understand what. Sometimes her gaze became distant, as if her thoughts were wandering to a place he couldn't follow. One day they lingered at the pier longer than usual. The sun was setting, painting the water copper. Emily sat on a bench watching the seagulls, while Claire stood next to Daniel. The wind ruffled her hair, and he suddenly found himself wanting to tell her that he was glad she was there. But instead he asked how long she had been living in Bar Harbor. She replied that it had been a little over 2 years, and immediately changed the subject to the weather. This caution, this ability to avoid personal topics, raised more and more questions in him. Why would someone who was so gentle and confident with children keep such a high wall around herself? He felt a growing desire to understand the story behind her silence, but he also knew that the slightest pressure could destroy the fragile trust that was just beginning to form. Meanwhile, Emily took her first small step in the literal sense. They were in the garden behind the house, Claire holding her hand, helping her step over a small curb. Suddenly, the girl let go of her hand and took one step forward on her own before grabbing hold of the support again. It was almost imperceptible, but it meant the world to the three of them. Daniel saw Claire holding back a smile, as if afraid that any extra emotion would spoil the moment. He wanted to hug them both, but he stood still, memorizing every moment. And yet, even in these warm moments, he felt an invisible barrier. Claire was here, close by, but always a step away, ready to leave at any moment. This thought haunted him, and he knew that sooner or later he would have to ask her what exactly she was so afraid of. That evening, the garden behind the house was bathed in the soft light of sunset. Maple leaves rustled quietly in the light breeze, and the air smelled of the sea, even though the pier was still several streets away. Emily stood on the path, leaning on Claire's arm, slowly shifting her feet. She had already learned to trust this support a little, but she still held on cautiously, as if each movement were a step over an abyss. Daniel watched from the porch, trying not to interfere. Claire whispered something to encourage the girl, and suddenly Emily let go of her hand. She stood alone for a moment, swaying slightly, then took a step forward and grabbed Claire's hand again. It was just one step, but the silence that enveloped the garden at that moment seemed louder than any applause. Daniel felt a lump in his throat. When they returned to the house, Emily fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted and overwhelmed by emotion. Daniel offered Claire some tea. They sat in the kitchen, and there was a special silence between them, not empty but filled with something that was about to be said. He thanked her for everything she had done for his daughter, but his words sounded too formal. Claire looked away, twirling the rim of her mug with her fingers. She seemed to be struggling with herself, deciding whether to say more. And she spoke. Her voice was low and steady, but behind it lay a weariness that could not be feigned. She told me that she had a younger brother, Nate. He was born with a serious illness that required constant care. Her parents worked late, so almost everything fell on her shoulders. She studied, read books to him, did exercises with him, believing that she could give him a chance at a normal life. She went to university and chose special education because she wanted to help children like him. They lived together for 10 years, and she learned to enjoy every day when he could laugh, despite his fatigue and pain. But one day he fell ill. At first, everything seemed normal, a cold, a fever. She took care of him, not thinking that it could be dangerous. But the illness turned out to be aggressive, and when they got to the hospital, the doctors could no longer do anything. He died 2 days later, and she was left with the thought that she had not noticed in time, had not insisted on an ambulance, that she could have saved him but did not. Since then she couldn't work with children because she saw him in them every time. She tried to start over, but any closeness became unbearable. So she moved to a small town and got a job in a cafe where she didn't have to look too deeply into other people's eyes. Daniel listened without interrupting. He could see how difficult it was for her to speak, and he understood that behind these words lay not just a story, but long years of silence and attempts to forget. When she finished, he said quietly that he had never asked her to replace anyone in their lives. He wasn't looking for a replacement for the wife he had lost, nor was he trying to fill the void with just anyone. He wanted her to stay because with her, Emily came alive, and he himself stopped feeling like a man who was always missing out on something. Claire lowered her eyes. She still seemed afraid to believe. But something had changed in her face. The fatigue remained, but a barely noticeable softness appeared in the depths, like a light in a window on an empty street. She made no promises, but she did not turn away. A few days later, the three of them went to the pier. It was a clear day, the sea glistened in the sun, and seagulls circled above the fishing boats, crying out. Emily walked between them, holding their hands tightly. She looked at Daniel, then at Claire, as if checking that they were still there and wouldn't disappear. Claire felt a small hand squeeze hers, and a warmth spread through her that she hadn't felt since Nate had been in her life. They stopped at the edge of the pier. The wind ruffled their hair and the water splashed below. Daniel whispered something to Emily and the girl laughed. For the first time in many years, Claire found herself laughing with someone without thinking about how it would end. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in many years she felt that she had a place to return to and people to stay with. And the little hand in her palm reminded her that home is not walls, but those who hold you when you are afraid to take a step. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.